10 a.m. along a trail leading from town A to town B. On Tuesday, another man set out, also at 10 a.m., from town B and made his way along the very same trail to town A. Here's the question. Is there a point on the trail that both men will reach at the exact same time of day? I recall as a teenager pondering Joe's riddle. How could we know? Maybe they were walking at different paces. Then I thought to myself, well, if they both set out on the same day, at the same time, heading towards each other, there would surely be a point along the trail at which they would meet. So it must be that even when they set out on different days, if they set out at the same time, then they will certainly reach a common point on the trail at the exact same time of day. I shared my pshat with you, Joe, about the two men, and for the only time in my life, I solved one of your riddles. Joe, as we stand here, I want to share with you another pshat about the two men and how they wound up in the same place. Joe, you were the men who set out on the first day, and I am the young boy who set out on the second day. And although I've traveled the path of life a full generation behind you, at so many junctures in my life, Joe, I've stopped and thought to myself, here I am, exactly in life where you were, Joe. I was so little when Svi first brought me home that I can still remember playing with the electric race cars in the basement, and that no matter what we did to keep them on course, they would go flying off the track. But the magic of the race cars downstairs was nothing like the magic of Shabbat that I discovered upstairs at your table with you and your family. Over dozens of Shabbatot, I remember the tastes and smells of dalat and the chicken soup, of pachar, and of bialis on Motzei Shabbat. I remember my makom kavu at the Shabbat table right next to your mother, Zichrono Livracha, who in her good nature could never tell when you were being serious or when you were humoring her. I remember being fascinated by the cubist painting that hung on the wall opposite me, and I remember understanding what the term Neshama Yetera meant every time Shabbat ended, and Dove pounced, that's the word for it, pounced on the piano to the tune of a Mavdil ben Kodesh L'Chol. And I remember the magic transformation of the basement from a place that we played on the floor into a Makom Kadosh as we set up the chairs for Shabbat davening. And it would be amazing for me as the men walked in and down the steps, and voila, the playroom had become a shul. But most of all, I remember you, Joe, at the Shabbat table. You were drunk, not on wine, but on Shabbat itself. I can hear you now rocking and modulating the speed with which you sang the Hitaneg B'Tanugim. And I remember you saying with glee and amazement, what Rabbi Weiss said this week about the sugya of Misha Para, just brilliant. And I was confused. You worked a full day and then got into a car with several other men and drove to another borough and paid this man to give a Gemara shiur. I had never seen anyone so infused with Avas HaTorah. When Svi and I were in the 8th grade, we split the Megillah reading in your shul, and I remember when the Kriya was over, you came over to me. You gave me a big hug. I was up to here on you, Joe. This is how high I was, and you said, Josh, you did a yeoman's job. And I had no idea what that meant, but I felt so proud and so loved. It was at your Shabbat table that I first encountered the idea of giving a Dvar Torah at a Shabbat table, and so every Shabbat, I came with a short Dvar Torah that I always worked hard on, and the highlight of the meal for me was to say it over and to see your smiling approval. Once over Shabbat dinner, you commented, the Goyim, they all hate us, all of them. And I was a little shocked. And after a moment or two, I remarked that I thought that maybe some of the Goyim hate us, but not all of them. And I felt very conflicted. Not that you would be offended by what I had said, but simply I so respected your opinion. But at the same time, I was quite sure that not all the Goyim hate us. And as the Shabbat dinner continued, I stewed in my conflict, looking for a way out. And to my great relief, I found it. Dr. Kahana, I said, you and your family left Vienna on the last boat before the war. I grew up in a place where I can walk around with my kippah on the head all the time without any problems. And that's why we see things differently. One day we set out for shul in the morning. Josh, you said to me, I want to make Aliyah, but it's not so simple. And you proceeded to outline 3 scenarios that would allow you to get to Israel. Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. The 3 plans all revolved around grown-up things. Sabbatical opportunities, early retirement plans, where your kids would wind up, the value of your house in Queens, visiting fellowship opportunities, and the like. And when you finished laying out before me Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C, you said to me, "So, what do you think I should do?" And I felt this enormous weight on my shoulders, and I said, "I think you should ask someone who knows more about these things than I do." And the amazing thing is that this became a ritual of our walk to shul on Shabbat morning. Every time we walked to shul, I'd say to you, "So what's new with Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C?" And you'd share with me the developments and which avenue was looking most promising. And it all was so natural. This is how we talked. It was only years later that I realized to myself that this was really unusual, and the grown-ups don't normally talk to their children's friends about their retirement plans. And so I began to reflect. What were you doing? Joe, what were you doing sharing all this with me? And then it became clear to me, Joe, you were teaching me how to dream. That to have a dream is not to harbor an unattainable fantasy, but to strive for something really important that you really want, but something that might not be achievable right now and might require careful planning and the seizing of opportunity. Joe, with your lifelong dream to live in Eretz Yisrael, you were a true Baal HaChalomot. And like Yosef HaTzadik, who would tell his children, "Pakod yifkod Elokim etchem, v'alitem et atzmotai mizeh." You instilled the love of Eretz Yisrael in them and in me as well, even though I had never stood foot here. With all those magical childhood memories, I arrived in adulthood and time after time found myself at the same point in the path that I'd remembered Joe traversing years earlier. I remember noticing that I felt a special bond and kinship with certain colleagues in my field, bonds that I share with nobody else. And I knew from my own home that colleagues at work are not always so collegial, and that work is often a place of rivalry and of tension. And then I thought of how lovingly, Joe, you spoke of your academic colleagues, Professor Sami Bracha, Zichrono Livracha, Professor Aviezri Frankel of Mechon Weizmann. These are men who I have never met, but whose names I only know from your loving praise of them. About 10 years ago, I was passing through New York on a trip, and I needed a place to stay. Chadesh Yimenu Kikedem, I called Joe and Lorraine and made up to stay with them. Joe picked me up at the end of the F line. I said, "Joe, you still teaching?" And his eyes lit up. He says, "I love teaching." And I knew exactly what he meant. All of those riddles that he told were really about teaching. He loved the one-on-one Socratic method of helping a person develop their thinking. Back in the car at the end of the F line, when he told me that he still relishes thinking about math, I knew exactly what he meant. There is no greater joy than pondering a fascinating academic problem and one day arriving at clarity about the issue. I recall from childhood moments at which Joe could pause in conversation, usually about someone's behavior or poor judgment, and Joe would make a brief comment and gaze off with his steel blue eyes, contemplating the human condition, taking a small break from the world and letting the depth of the thought take him to wherever it did. And when I'm in that contemplative mode, I think of Joe. Last September, Joe wasn't doing so well, and I came for a visit. Just like when I was little, I wanted to share my Torah with him and receive his approval. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us. Opposite me in the living room, I saw again the Cubist painting that had fascinated me since childhood. Lorraine and I each had Tanachim in front of us, but it was hard for Joe to sit up straight and follow a text on the table because of the effects of his Parkinson's. "It's okay," he said. "I'll listen." And he sat at the head of the table and stared straight down. We were learning the mashal of Kivsat Harash and the story of David and Bathsheba. I read through the whole story and then started to give my take on the meaning of the mashal of the poor man and the kivsa. The whole time, Joe stared straight down, expressionless. I had no idea. Was he liking what I was saying? Was he even following? I pointed out that the mashal Natan Hanavi uses 3 words, le'echol, v'lishtot, v'lishkav. And then in the previous parak, when Uriah describes what his visit home to Bathsheba would be like, he also uses these same 3 words. And at that point, Joe, with no text in front of him and without looking up, he interjected, "And the 3 words in both places are in the same order." And I looked down in my Tanakh, and I saw that he was right. The last time I visited Joe, I was alone with him in the room, and I said to him, "Joe, looking back on it all, what do you say?" At that moment, the morphine lifted, the Parkinson's disappeared, and his eyes lit up. And he said, "I've lived a beautiful life. Every moment has been precious." And I thought to myself, trail a day later, Joe, you've been a mora derech for me on my path for as long as I can remember. I can only pray that I too will be zo.
Down to the bottom and make 2 shurot for the Avelim to go through. After following that, we'll daven mincha here, and the family will be sitting shiva